The man who collapsed on Georgia Brooks's doorstep in the autumn of 1878 was bleeding so badly that she could hear the blood dripping from the porch boards before she even opened the door. She had been sitting at her kitchen table in Harlow Creek, New Mexico territory, mending the hem of her second-best dress by the light of a kerosene lamp when she heard the thud. At first she thought it was a deer, or maybe the old hound from the Dawson place wandering again. Then she heard a groan, low and wretched and unmistakably human, and she was on her feet before she had fully made the decision to move. Georgia was 26 years old, and she had lived alone on the small homestead since her father had passed the previous winter. She knew how to handle herself. She kept a short-barreled Colt revolver on the shelf beside the door, and she took it down now, cocking it as she pushed the door open with her shoulder. The man lay crumpled against the porch railing, one arm hooked through the spindles as though he had tried to catch himself on the way down and failed. He was tall, even collapsed, broad through the shoulders, dressed in trail-worn clothing that was dark with dust and darker with blood. His hat had rolled 2 feet away. His face was turned toward her, and in the lamplight spilling from the kitchen she could see that his features were sharp and angular and very still, the kind of still that made a person's stomach drop. She kept the gun level and crouched down beside him, pressing 2 fingers to the side of his throat. His pulse was there, thin as a thread, but there. Georgia lowered the gun. She did not know this man. She was certain of that. She had a good memory for faces, and his face, despite the grime and the pallor of blood loss, was not one she recognized. His dark hair was too long at the collar, and there was a week's worth of stubble along his jaw. She would have remembered this face. Still, a man was bleeding on her porch, and whatever else Georgia Brooks might have been uncertain about in her life, she had never once been uncertain about what was right. She tucked the revolver into the waistband of her skirt, got her arms under his, and began the slow and considerable labor of dragging a grown man through her front door. It took 20 minutes to get him onto the narrow cot in the back room that she had used for her father during his illness. By the time she had him flat on his back, she was sweating through her shirtwaist and her lower back ached fiercely, but she was too focused to care. She lit the second lamp and held it over him, looking for the wound. She found it on his left side, just below his ribs. Something had gone into him, probably a bullet given the shape and depth of what she could see, and it had gone deep. She had no doctor within reasonable riding distance. The town of Harlow Creek had a man named Pettifer who called himself a physician, but he was drunk before noon most days, and she trusted her own hands more than his. Her mother had been a practical woman with a practical knowledge of wounds, and Georgia had learned everything her mother knew. She boiled water on the stove and gathered her supplies. She worked with a concentration that left no room for fear, cleaning the wound carefully, probing with clean linen strips to understand the depth and angle. The bullet had passed through, which was its one mercy. She packed the wound and bound it tightly, and when she had done everything she could do, she sat back in the chair beside the cot and allowed herself to breathe. He was still unconscious. She studied his face again in the lamplight, more carefully now that she was not in a state of emergency. He had a strong jaw, high cheekbones, a straight nose that had been broken once and healed a little crooked. His hands were large, resting at his sides, and even in their stillness they looked like hands that had worked hard for a long time. She leaned forward and pulled the lamp a little closer to have a better look at his left hand, the one nearest her, because there was something about the way he had hooked it through the porch railing that had caught at something in the back of her mind. She was not sure why. She looked at the hand now, at the long fingers and the calluses across the palm, and then she saw it, and the breath left her body entirely. On the back of his left hand, running from the base of his index finger to the knob of his wrist, was a scar, not a fresh scar. An old one, years old, silvered and smooth, the kind of scar that had been made by something very deliberate. It had a shape that was unusual, curved slightly at one end, almost like the crescent of a moon. Georgia sat very still for a long moment. Then she got up and went to the small wooden trunk at the foot of her own bed in the next room and lifted the lid with hands that were not quite steady. Beneath the folded letters and the photograph of her parents and the small Bible with its cracked spine, she found what she was looking for. A child's drawing, made in faded pencil on a torn scrap of paper. A drawing of a hand with a scar on it, made by a 12-year-old girl for reasons she had never stopped being able to explain except that she had wanted to remember. She carried the drawing back to the lamp and looked at it beside the hand of the unconscious man on her cot. The scar matched perfectly, crescent moon shape, base of the index finger to the knob of the wrist, left hand. Georgia sat down very slowly in the chair and pressed both of her own hands against her face. Lionel Winslow. The name rose up from 14 years of distance, like something that had been waiting underwater for exactly this moment. Lionel Winslow, who had been 18 years old to her 12, when his family had spent one summer in Harlow Creek before moving on west. Lionel Winslow, who had climbed her father's apple tree on a dare and fallen from it, and cut his hand on the rusted nail her father had left in the bark when he removed the old fence board. Lionel Winslow, who had sat beside her on the porch steps while she wrapped his hand in her apron and told her she was braver than any girl he had ever met, and then corrected himself and said braver than any person. She had been 12 years old and she had told herself, privately and very seriously, that she intended to marry him someday, the way children do. She had never expected to have the chance to even remember it, and here he was, bleeding on her cot. She looked at his face again with new eyes, and yes, she could see it now. The bones were the same, just sharpened by time and weather. The brow was the same. She had no idea what the color of his eyes was because they were still closed, and she could not remember whether she had known back then, and the thought made her almost laugh despite everything. This absurd moment of wondering what color his eyes were, while he was lying unconscious, possibly dying in her spare room. She pulled the chair closer to the cot and took his wrist gently between her fingers to check his pulse again. Still thin, still there. She was going to have to stay up through the night to watch him. She settled herself in the chair and told herself firmly that what she was feeling was simply the strangeness of recognition, nothing more. It had been 14 years. She did not know this man. The scar was a coincidence of memory, and it meant nothing beyond the fact that she had an unusually precise recall for the things that had mattered to her when she was 12 years old. She told herself this for approximately 3 hours before she gave up telling herself anything and simply watched him breathe. He broke into a fever just before dawn, the way serious wounds often did. Georgia had been expecting it. She kept the fire going, kept the cloths cool and wet on his forehead, talked to him quietly the way her mother had always talked to sick people, not because they could hear but because it helped the person doing the talking to stay calm and focused. She told him about the weather, about the state of her garden, about the price of flour in Harlow Creek since the new merchant had taken over from Old Holloway. She did not tell him his name or that she thought she knew who he was. That conversation could wait for when he was capable of having it. The fever climbed through the morning and she fought it hard, changing the cloths every few minutes, forcing water into him when he was restless enough to swallow. He muttered in his fever, disconnected words that she caught at the edges without quite meaning to. His name, a woman's name that was not hers. The word Missouri twice, something that sounded like it might have been an apology. By midday the fever had not broken but it had stopped climbing, and Georgia allowed herself to eat a piece of cold cornbread standing at the kitchen counter before she went back to him. He was not entirely unconscious in the afternoon. He came and went, his eyes sometimes half open but glassy and unfocused. Once he seemed to look directly at her and she leaned forward, her heart doing something unreasonable, but his eyes closed again without any sign that he had seen her. The fever broke on the second night, sometime past midnight, the way fevers broke when they had been fought properly, all at once and then over. He lay quietly drenched in sweat, and his color was better, and his pulse was stronger, And Georgia wrung out the cloths and changed the bandage and told herself that the worst was likely past. She was dozing in the chair when he spoke. "Where?" he said, clearly and without any fever blurring, and she was awake immediately. "You are in Harlow Creek, New Mexico territory," she said, keeping her voice even. "You collapsed on my porch 2 nights ago. You had been shot." He was quiet for a moment, processing this. She could see him doing it, the careful inventory of the conscious mind coming back to itself. "The bullet," he said, "passed through. I cleaned the wound and bound it. You had a fever, but it broke in the night." She hesitated. "You are going to be all right, I believe, if you rest and the wound does not get corrupted." Another silence. Then he turned his head toward her slowly and opened his eyes. They were gray. A clear, dark gray, like creek water over slate, and Georgia felt something shift in the center of her chest that she tried very hard to ignore. "I am obliged to you," he said. His voice was rough with disuse and illness, but there was a steadiness in it that matched his eyes. "I could hardly leave you on the porch," she said. A small movement at the corner of his mouth that might have been the beginning of something warmer if he had been in less pain. "No, I suppose that would have been an unkind thing to do." He looked up at the ceiling, gathering himself. "How long have I been here? 2 days and 2 nights. Lord," he closed his eyes again briefly. "I have caused you a great deal of trouble." "Considerable trouble," she agreed pleasantly. "Do you think you could drink some broth? I have some on the stove." He looked at her again with those gray eyes. "Yes, thank you." She went to the kitchen and ladled broth from the pot she had been keeping warm, and she carried it back to the room and helped him sit up slightly against the pillow, which cost him a visible effort and some gritted teeth. She held the tin cup for him to drink from because his hands were not quite steady yet. He did not protest, which told her he was sensible enough to know when he was not yet capable of managing on his own. He drank the broth slowly, and she watched his color improve incrementally with every swallow. When he was finished, she set the cup aside and folded her hands in her lap and looked at him. "I am Georgia Brooks," she said. He nodded. "Lionel Winslow," he said. "And I am in your debt, Miss Brooks." She waited. He did not recognize her. Why would he? She had been 12 years old. The years had changed her considerably. She was not particularly surprised, only aware of a small, complicated feeling that she could not quite name. She watched him settle back against the pillow and close his eyes, exhaustion pulling him under again almost immediately. And she thought about the drawing in the trunk and the nail in the apple tree, and a summer afternoon 14 years ago when a boy with a crooked nose and gray eyes had told her she was braver than any person he had ever met. She thought she would keep that to herself a little longer. He slept through the rest of the day and the night, a healing sleep rather than a fever sleep, deep and quiet and steady. She checked on him regularly, changed his bandage in the evening, made sure he had water within reach. In the morning he was awake when she came in, sitting up on his own, which he clearly should not have been doing given the tightness of his expression. But he was the kind of man who pushed before he should. She could see that already. "You should be lying down," she said. "I have been lying down for 2 days," he said. "And you should lie down for 2 more at minimum." She settled her hands on her hips and looked at him directly. "Mr. Winslow, I did not spend 2 nights fighting your fever so that you could tear that wound open by sitting up too quickly. Lie down." He looked at her with something that was either surprise or appreciation or possibly both, and he lay back down. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and the very slight dryness in his tone told her he was not used to being told what to do, but that he was capable of recognizing good sense when it was presented firmly enough. "Good," she said. "Now, can you tell me what happened to you? I should know if there is anyone likely to come looking." His jaw tightened slightly. She watched him decide how much to tell her, and she gave him time to decide it because she was not in the habit of pressing people. "I was riding through the canyon east of here," he said at last. "There are men who have reason to want me dead. One of them found me in a better position than I found him." "You killed him?" she asked, direct and without drama. "No, I left him with a headache and took his horse, which is probably still tied outside if the coyotes have not made off with it." He paused. "I did not intend to lead trouble to your door, Miss Brooks. I did not know there was a homestead here. I simply ran out of horse and ground at approximately the same time." She nodded, weighing this. "What is the nature of these men? Are they outlaws, or is this a personal matter?" He studied her for a moment. "Both," he said. "That is not particularly illuminating." "No," he agreed. "I am sorry. I do not wish to put you in a position where knowing becomes a danger to you." She considered this. It was, she thought, a principled thing to say, and it sounded genuine rather than evasive. She let it rest. "Your horse is still outside," she said. "It ate half my kitchen garden, for which I hold you partially responsible." She paused. "I will need to go into town today for supplies. If there is anything you require specifically, I am willing to fetch it." "I require nothing beyond what you have already given me." He looked at the ceiling and then back at her. "Miss Brooks, I am not a man who is comfortable being in debt." "I did not offer help to put you in debt," she said. "I offered it because you were bleeding on my porch and it seemed like the right thing to do." She picked up the empty water glass from the beside table and moved to go. "Rest, Mr. Winslow. I will bring you breakfast when I come back from the garden." She was almost through the door when he said her name, or rather her last name, in a quiet way that made her pause. "Brooks," he said. "Are you related to a man named Henry Brooks, a farmer? He had an apple tree he was very proud of." The stillness that moved through Georgia was enormous and entirely interior. She turned back to face him. "Henry Brooks was my father," she said carefully. "He passed last winter." Something crossed Lionel Winslow's face. She watched it cross, watched the calculation, watched the recognition beginning to form at its edges the way light forms at the edge of the horizon before the sun actually comes. "You had a daughter," he said slowly. "A girl, young, dark-haired." His eyes moved to her face and she watched the moment arrive. "Lord Almighty," he said very quietly. "Hello, Lionel," she said. He looked at her with those gray eyes wide open, and she thought that she would remember the expression on his face for a very long time. It was the expression of a man encountering something that should have been impossible and discovering that it was not. "You were 12 years old," he said. I am 26 now." "You wrapped my hand in your apron." He said it almost to himself. "You had cut it on the old nail in my father's apple tree," she said. "You told me I was braver than any person you had ever met." He was quiet for a long time. She did not fill the silence. She stood in the doorway and let him have it. "I thought about that afternoon once in a while over the years," he said eventually, and his voice had changed, had lost its careful neutrality and become something that sounded more honest and less guarded. "I could never quite remember the girl's name. I remembered the apron and the apple tree and being told I had to hold still." "You were very bad at holding still," she said. Something that had been a ghost of a smile on and off since he woke became, briefly, a real one. It changed his whole face. Georgia told herself firmly that she was not moved by this. "I am still very bad at holding still," he said. "It remains a personal failing." "So I observe," she said. "However, for the next several days you are going to practice." She went to make breakfast, and she was careful to maintain an expression of complete composure until she was in the kitchen with the door closed, at which point she sat down at the table and pressed both hands over her heart for a moment, just a moment, before she got up and started the fire. He was a good patient in the sense that he did as he was told when the reasoning was made clear to him, which she suspected was about as cooperative as Lionel Winslow had ever been in his life. He slept a great deal, which was what his body needed. He ate everything she brought him. When she changed his bandage each morning and evening, he lay completely still, which had cost him something the first day but became easier, and she was careful to be clinical and efficient in her movements so as not to make anything awkward. But the conversations that developed between them over those healing days were not clinical, and were not awkward either. They were something she had not expected, which was natural. He told her about the years since that summer, and she listened, building the picture of the man from the scattered materials he provided. He had gone west from Harlow Creek with his family, and his family had eventually dissolved the way frontier families sometimes did, his father dying in a mining accident in Arizona Territory when Lionel was 21, his mother returning east to her own family, his younger brother following her. Lionel had stayed west because by then the West had become the only country he knew. He had worked cattle drives, had scouted for a railroad survey crew, had spent 2 years as a deputy in a small Texas town, before deciding that the law was something he believed in more than he believed in most of the men who enforced it. He was 32 years old, she calculated, and the life was written clearly in his face and his hands, and the easy, competent way he moved even when he was wounded. The men who were looking for him, she learned, were connected to the cattle drive years. A man named Creel had run a very particular kind of operation in the Texas Panhandle, and Lionel had gathered enough evidence against him to have him properly prosecuted, and Creel's associates had not forgiven this. Creel himself was in a federal prison, but his people were still out. "You testified against him," Georgia said on the third day, when she had enough pieces to understand the shape. "Someone had to," Lionel said simply. She looked at his profile and thought about what it cost to be that kind of person in 1878 in the territories, where the law was a suggestion and geography was a shield, and the men who chose to do the right thing were very often the men who ended up bleeding on porch steps. "Is it likely they will find you here?" she asked. "Unlikely," he said. "The man in the canyon did not know where I went. He may assume I died in the desert." "Good," she said briskly, and tied off the new bandage. She told him about her own years in turn, because he asked, and because it seemed fair. Her mother had died when Georgia was 17, and Henry Brooks had done his best to hold the homestead together and had needed help doing it, and Georgia had given it. She had been engaged once, briefly, to a merchant's son in town who had decided that the territory was not to his liking and had returned to Philadelphia without her, which she had concluded, after a period of reflection, was entirely for the best. She grew her own vegetables and kept 3 chickens and 2 goats, sold small amounts of corn and sweet potatoes to the Harlow Creek General Store in season, traded her practical knowledge of healing with her neighbors when they needed it. "You live alone," he said. He said it without judgment, simply taking the fact in. "I do. Is it hard?" She thought about this honestly rather than dismissively. "Sometimes," she said. "Mostly I am good at my own company, but there are days in the winter when the silence is a different kind of silence, and then yes, it is hard." He nodded. She had the sense that he understood this from the inside. On the 4th day she came into the room in the morning to find him sitting up in the chair beside the window, the bandage intact, and his color genuinely good, looking out at the flat brown expanse of the territory, with the kind of expression that meant he was thinking about something he was not sure how to approach. She set his breakfast on the small table beside him and pulled the other chair across from his. This had become their custom, eating breakfast together when he was strong enough, and she had found herself looking forward to it with a frequency and specificity that she thought was worth noticing. "You are looking very serious," she said. "I have been thinking about something," he said. "What is it?" He looked at her directly. She had noticed this about him, how he met eyes rather than sliding away from them, how his gray gaze was steady and undemanding, but also entirely present. "I owe you my life," he said. "I want you to understand that I mean that specifically and not as a phrase." "I understand," she said, "and I have been sitting here for 4 days now in your house in a room that belonged to your father, and you have been kind in a way that goes past what any sense of obligation requires." He paused. "I want you to know that I am aware of that." Georgia looked at him for a moment. "Lionel," she said, and the ease with which his given name came out of her surprised them both slightly, she could tell. "I have not been kind to you out of obligation. I told you this." "Then why?" he asked, and the question was entirely genuine. She looked down at her hands, then back up at him. "Partly because you were injured and I am capable of helping," she said. And partly because when you were 12 years old on a porch step with a cut hand, you treated a 12-year-old girl like her opinion was worth something. And that is the kind of thing a person remembers. The silence between them was warm rather than empty. I remember it too, he said quietly. I just did not remember your name. Well, she said, reaching for her breakfast. Now you do, he smiled. A full smile this time, unguarded, and it landed somewhere in the center of her chest and stayed there for the rest of the morning. On the fifth day she came in from the garden to find him standing at the kitchen counter, one hand braced against the wood for support, attempting to make coffee. Absolutely not, she said. I made a mess of the coffee this morning, she heard him mutter. I can hear you, she said. I know, he said. I was hoping the guilt would work in my favor. She made him sit at the kitchen table while she finished the coffee, and when she set the cup in front of him, he looked up at her with an expression that was almost boyish. And she thought that she was in very serious trouble, and she went to tend the garden with considerable urgency. On the sixth day she saddled her horse and rode into Harlow Creek for supplies. The town was small and weathered, 24 buildings arranged along a main street that turned to mud in the rain, and was now dry as bone under the late October sun. The general store was run by a woman named Mrs. Aldridge, whose husband was a rancher, and who knew everything that happened within a 20-mile radius of Harlow Creek. You look tired, Georgia, Mrs. Aldridge said, measuring out the flour Georgia had asked for. I have had company, Georgia said, and immediately recognized this as the wrong thing to say because Mrs. Aldridge's eyebrows moved with tremendous interest. Oh. A man was injured on the road near my place, Georgia said, keeping her voice even. I have been nursing him, she paused. A stranger, he is recovering. What sort of man? Mrs. Aldridge asked. The sort who was badly hurt and needed help, Georgia said. He should be well enough to travel in a few more days. She was not sure why the last part came out with a slight flatness, but she was aware of it. She bought her supplies and accepted Mrs. Aldridge's advice about a poultice that her own husband had found useful for a similar wound some years back, and she rode home through the clear, cold afternoon, with the feeling of the sky being very large and the homestead being very specific and small and known in a way that felt different than it had a week ago. When she got home, Lionel was sitting on the porch step. Not because he had violated her instructions about resting, she noted, but because he had clearly moved slowly and carefully, and was sitting in a way that did not strain his wound, and he looked up when she came in through the gate with the same expression she imagined she had on her own face, which was the expression of a person who was glad to see someone. You should be inside, she said, but without the firmness she would have meant it with. The sun was good, he said. She put the horse up and brought the supplies into the kitchen and came back out to sit beside him on the step, and neither of them found this remarkable, and she thought that was perhaps the most remarkable thing of all. They sat in the long afternoon light and he told her about Missouri, which was where the woman's name in his fever had come from, a woman he had been engaged to 7 years ago who had died of typhoid fever before they could be married. He told it carefully and without theatrics, the way a person tells a story that has been fully grieved and accepted rather than being still raw, and she listened in the same spirit. I have not told many people about her, he said. Why me? She asked. He turned his head to look at her. The sun was in the west and the light fell sideways across his face, finding the angles of it, and she kept her eyes on the middle distance because she did not entirely trust herself at the moment. Because you listened to me when I was 12 and bleeding, he said, and you have listened to me every day this week, and you do not fill silence with noise just because you can. He paused. And because I believe you would be honest with me if I said something foolish. What are you afraid of saying that might be foolish? She asked. The pause that followed was long enough to have a texture. Miss Brooks, he said, and the return to formality was so deliberate that she did actually look at him then. He was looking at her with that steady gray gaze and something in it that was different from what had been there before, something that had moved closer and stopped being quite so careful. Georgia, he corrected himself quietly. She waited. I am going to be well enough to travel in a few days, he said, and I know that. And I also know that sitting on this porch step, I am not sure I want to be the kind of man who is well enough to travel in a few days." She looked at him for a long time. The chickens made their small, persistent noises in the yard. A hawk moved slowly across the wide sky. "You are being careful," she said. "I am trying to be," he said. "I do not want to say something that is simply the gratitude of a man whose life was saved speaking." "Is that what you think it is?" He was quiet. "No," he said at last. "I do not think that is what it is, but I want to be honest with you about the difficulty of knowing for certain." Georgia appreciated this more than she could easily express. She had known men who spoke easily and meant little, and she had known men who struggled with what they meant and said it anyway, and she knew which kind she trusted. "I find," she said carefully to the middle distance and then to him, "that I am also not particularly eager for you to be well enough to travel." She kept her voice even, "and I have been trying to be honest with myself about that." He did not immediately fill this with anything, and she was grateful. They sat with it for a while. "That is something worth thinking on," he said finally. "Yes," she agreed. "It is." They went inside as the sun went down, and she made dinner and they ate together at the kitchen table. And the conversation was easier than it had ever been, and also charged with something new and unspoken that sat between them like a candle, giving off light without any decision being made about whether to keep it burning. Over the next 3 days, Lionel's strength returned with a speed that impressed her and frustrated her in approximately equal measure, because she was a good nurse and had done her job well, and also because every day he was stronger was a day closer to the question of what happened next. He started helping with small tasks around the homestead, things that did not strain his wound. He repaired the gate latch she had been meaning to fix for 3 months. He found a problem with the water trough that he resolved with a length of rope and considerable ingenuity. He talked to the horses in a low voice that she could hear from the kitchen window, and the horses were visibly pleased about this. She caught herself watching him from the window more than once, and she stopped catching herself after a while. On the 9th day since he had arrived, she was hanging washing on the line and he came to help without being asked, and they worked side by side in the wind, and his arm reached past hers to clip a corner of the sheet, and she was very aware of the warmth and the nearness and the deliberate care with which he did not press the proximity. "You were going to tell me something yesterday," she said. "When the Dawson boy came by for his mother's medicine. You never finished." He glanced at her. "I was going to say that I have been thinking about where I go when I leave here." She said nothing. The wind pulled at the washing. "I have not had a home in a long time," he said. "I have had places I stayed and work I did and directions I was going, but not a home." He lifted another shirt from the basket. "I have been thinking that might be something worth addressing." "And where would home be?" she asked, keeping her voice neutral. "That would depend on certain things," he said. "What kind of things?" He stopped, the shirt in his hands, and looked at her. The wind moved between them, carrying the smell of soap and dry grass and autumn. "Whether I would be welcome," he said. Georgia looked at him steadily. "Lionel," she said, "if you are asking me what I think you are asking me, then say it plainly." He set the shirt down. He turned to face her fully, and she turned to face him, and they stood in the wide New Mexico morning with the washing moving in the wind around them. "I am asking," he said, "whether you would be willing to have me stay, not as a patient and not as a stranger you did a kindness for." He paused. "I am asking whether there is something here worth staying for, whether you feel what I feel. And if you do, I would like the opportunity to prove to you, properly and without haste, that I am a man worth knowing over time." She looked at his face, at those steady gray eyes and the honesty in them that she had been watching build and accumulate for 9 days, and she thought about the 12-year-old girl on the porch steps and what she would have thought of this exact moment. And she thought that the 12-year-old girl would have been entirely unsurprised, because she had always suspected that the world was capable of moments this particular. "I think," Georgia said, "that you are already a man worth knowing over time. And I think you have known that since at least the 3rd day you were here." He exhaled. It was a small sound, but it carried a great deal of weight. "Then I am asking," he said more quietly, "if you will let me stay." "I will let you stay," she said, "and I expect you to help fix the fence along the eastern boundary, which has needed doing since September." He laughed. It was not the polite sound she had heard from him occasionally during conversation, but something real and full, and it was the most beautiful sound she had heard on the homestead in a very long time. She smiled and picked up the washing basket and walked back toward the house, and when she glanced back, he was watching her with an expression on his face that she filed away and kept. They did not rush. Georgia was firm about this in her own mind, not because she doubted what she felt, but because she valued it, and the things you value you tend with care. Lionel seemed to understand this not because she explained it, but because he felt the same way she thought. He was a patient man underneath the restlessness, or he had learned to be. He wrote a letter to the county seat explaining his presence in Harlow Creek and the situation with Creel's associates. And 3 days later, a deputy marshal named Cooper rode through and confirmed that 2 of the men involved had been picked up in Texas, and the third had been reported dead in a separate incident unrelated to Lionel. The threat was not certain to be entirely resolved, Cooper said, but it was considerably diminished and the major players were accounted for. When Cooper rode out, Lionel stood in the gate and watched him go, and Georgia stood beside him and felt the shift in the atmosphere, the easing of a tension she had not entirely admitted she was carrying. "You can stay without looking over your shoulder now," she said. "More or less," he said. "Cooper's assessment is reasonably sound." He looked down at her. "I want you to know that if there were still a real danger, I would not stay. I would not bring that to your door." "I know that," she said. "I want to make sure you know that," he said, and the seriousness of it, the care underneath it, landed with a precision that made her breath unsteady. "I know," she said again, more softly. He reached over and took her hand, which he had not done before, and he held it with the same deliberate gentleness he brought to everything, and they stood at the gate and watched the deputy's dust trail settle, his hand over hers, his left hand with the scar. She felt the raised line of it under her thumb, and she thought of a summer afternoon and a rusty nail and an apron and a boy who had seen her, really seen her, and she turned her hand so that she was holding his properly. He looked down at their joined hands and then at her face, and whatever was in his expression she chose not to examine directly because she was not ready to be that open in the October daylight, but she squeezed his hand once and led him back up the path toward the house. November came to Harlow Creek in a cold, bright rush, the days short and clear and the nights deeply cold, and Lionel was fully healed and fully present, which were 2 different things and both equally important. He had ridden into town and hired himself out to the Dawson Ranch for day work, while he and Georgia took the time they had agreed to take, and he rode the 4 miles back to the homestead each evening in time for dinner. And she knew when she heard his horse on the road because something in her settled into an alignment it did not maintain during the hours he was absent. They talked on the porch in the evenings when the cold allowed it, wrapped in blankets, watching the stars, which were extraordinary this far from any city, spread across the sky in a density that made the universe feel both enormous and immediate. He told her about the stars he knew, the ones he had learned to navigate by on the cattle drives, and she told him about the constellations her father had shown her as a child, and they found the places where their knowledge overlapped and the places where it did not. There was a night in the middle of November when she fell asleep against his shoulder on the porch bench, and she woke to find his arm around her and his voice, low and even, still talking about something, describing a landscape in Arizona he had passed through once, and she lay completely still because the warmth of it was so complete that she did not want to disturb it. He noticed she was awake because she noticed things about him. She thought he probably noticed things about her too. "You should have woken me," she said. "You needed the sleep," he said. "You have been pushing yourself hard getting the winter stores laid in." She sat up and looked at him. The lamp was low between them on the bench, and his face was a study in the quiet attention he gave her. "Lionel," she said. "Georgia," he said. She did not look away. She thought of all the things she might say, and all the things he might say, and then she moved toward him, and he moved toward her, and the first time they kissed was on the front porch of the homestead her father had built in the middle of a November night with the stars burning cold and enormous overhead. It was not a tentative kiss. It was not rushed either. It was exactly what two people looked like when they had been building toward something with patience and intention, and finally allowed the building to arrive. When they pulled back, he had both hands on her face, and she had her hands folded against his chest, and they looked at each other in the lamplight. "I have wanted to do that," he said, "since approximately the 6th day I was in your spare room and you told me to lie down with a firmness that I found completely unreasonable and also very compelling." She laughed, a real laugh, and his thumbs traced along her cheekbones as she laughed. "Only the 6th day," she said. "Perhaps earlier," he admitted. "I was trying to be sensible. How is that working for you?" "Not particularly well," he said. "I recommend against it." She pulled his hands down from her face but kept them in hers, and she leaned her head against his shoulder again, and he pressed his lips to the top of her head, and they sat there for a long time listening to the night. He asked her father to marry her, in a manner of speaking, which meant that he went to the small wooden cross at the edge of the garden where Henry Brooks was buried, and stood there for a long time one afternoon in late November while Georgia was in town. She did not know he had done this until he told her, that evening, which was when he asked her. Not on his knee, because he was, as she had observed, not a man given to the theatrical, but at the kitchen table after dinner with his hands around his coffee cup and his eyes on hers, and the directness that was simply how he was. "I have been thinking about what I want," he said, "and I know that what I want is to build something with you. If that is what you want too." He looked at his coffee and then back up. "Will you marry me, Georgia Brooks?" She had known this was coming, and she had thought about her answer for 2 weeks, and she gave it without hesitation. "Yes," she said. "I will marry you, Lionel Winslow." The exhale that left him was enormous with relief, which made her smile because she had not realized he had been uncertain, and the uncertainty of a man that steady and deliberate was the most touching thing she had seen in years. "Good," he said, with as much composure as he could manage, which was not very much. "Good," she agreed. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the left one with the scar, and she turned her palm up and held it. They were married in Harlow Creek in December of 1878, in the small church that doubled as the schoolhouse, by the Reverend Fletcher, who had the unfortunate habit of forgetting the middle portion of the ceremony, and had to be gently prompted by his wife. Mrs. Aldridge from the general store attended, and the Dawsons attended, and a young couple named Fairweather, who had the neighboring homestead to the north, attended with their 3 children who behaved with mixed success. And outside the windows the sky was a pale winter blue, and the cottonwood trees along the creek stood bare and silver in the light. Georgia wore her best dress, which she had let out slightly at the sleeves and fitted with a new collar she had made from a length of cream wool she had been saving without quite knowing what she was saving it for, and she thought now that she had known all along. Lionel wore a clean white shirt and the dark coat he had bought in town the week before, and he stood at the front of the church with his hands at his sides and his gray eyes on her from the moment she came through the door, and she walked toward him with the full and settled certainty of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. When Reverend Fletcher asked the questions, Lionel said yes with a steadiness that she felt in her chest, and when it was her turn she said yes with the same, and when Fletcher told Lionel he could kiss his bride, Lionel cupped her face in his hands the way he had on the porch that first night and kissed her in the same full and unhurried way, and Mrs. Dawson made a small sound of approval from the second pew. The dinner afterward was at the Dawsons' house because it was larger, and it was loud and warm and people ate too much, and the children ran, and the Dawson boy played the fiddle badly but enthusiastically, and Georgia sat at the long table with Lionel's hand in hers and looked at the faces of her small community and felt a fullness that she had not expected from this exact life but that she recognized for what it was. Home. It was home. They rode back to the homestead together in the dark, their breath showing in the cold air, and when they came up the path and Lionel helped her down from her horse, and she stood in the doorway of the house her father had built, the house she had lived in and worked in and grieved in and hoped in and never quite given up on. She turned and looked at her husband and thought about 14 years and a rusty nail and a scar on the back of a hand. And she thought that the distance between the beginning and the end of a story was never as straight as it looked from either end. Lionel came up the step and opened the door for her, and she went inside, and he followed her in, and he closed the door against the cold night. Winter was long and close in the homestead, and Georgia found that close was not the same as small. They learned each other in the way that married people do, in the specific rhythms of shared days and shared work, and the private language that builds between two people who pay attention to each other. She learned that he woke easily and was fully alert in moments, a habit from years of camps and trail. He learned that she was methodical in the mornings and not to interrupt her systems before she had finished her first cup of coffee. She learned that he had a patience for detail work, could spend an afternoon repairing tack or mending harness with an attention that surprised her given his history. He learned that her capacity for practical problem-solving was extraordinary, and that she did not mind being told when she had a good idea, just being told in a way that sounded like an observation rather than a surprise. They disagreed about things. He thought the eastern fence should be rebuilt entirely rather than repaired section by section. She thought rebuilding it entirely was wasteful of materials they could not afford until spring. They argued about it for 3 days with the pleasant intensity of two people who enjoy an argument where both parties are genuinely engaged, and then they reached a compromise that involved rebuilding the worst 2 sections and reinforcing the rest, which was in retrospect what both of them had actually meant all along. They disagreed about the dog, when one showed up on the gate in January, a thin and scarred hound with one torn ear who looked at Lionel with an expression of enormous hope. Georgia thought they could not afford another animal in winter. Lionel thought the dog was no trouble and would earn his keep against the rabbits in the garden. The dog stayed, and it earned its keep, and Georgia allowed this to be logged as a point in Lionel's favor, which he noted with satisfaction. They named the dog Russell, after the sound he made investigating the tall grass at the edge of the property, and he became part of the homestead in the simple, organic way that good animals do. The winter was cold, but the stores held, and they were comfortable if not prosperous. Lionel had money saved from his years of work. Not a great deal, but enough to make the spring planting fuller than Georgia had managed alone, and they talked through the summer plans carefully. What to plant, how much, what to sell and what to keep, and Georgia thought often that there was something almost as intimate as anything else about sitting at a table with another person and planning a future together in practical terms. She was pregnant by March. She knew before she told him, held the knowledge to herself for 2 weeks while she was certain, examining how she felt about it and discovering that what she felt was deeply, entirely, quietly glad. She told him on a Sunday morning at the kitchen table in the same direct way that she did most things. He was very still for a moment, and then he set his coffee cup down and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something raw and open and enormous. "Georgia," he said. "Yes," she said. "A baby." He came around the table and crouched beside her chair and took her hands in his and looked up at her, and she had the impression that there was a great deal he wanted to say and could not immediately locate the words for, which was unfamiliar territory for a man who was generally in command of language. "Are you glad?" he said at last. "Very," she said. "So am I," he said, and his voice was rough at the edges with something she loved him for. He pressed his lips to her hands, both of them, the left one first, and then he stood and folded her against him with a gentleness that was somehow more complete than anything that had preceded it, and she rested her head against his chest and listened to his heartbeat, steady as a clock. Spring came to the territory in a rush of color that always surprised her, as though she forgot each winter how vivid the land became when it turned. The garden went in, larger than anything she had managed alone, and Lionel had a facility for the physical labor of it that freed her from the hardest work as her pregnancy progressed, not because she could not do it, but because he could not entirely keep himself from wanting to be useful. He was the kind of person, she discovered, who expressed care through the doing of things. He checked the water trough before she needed to ask. He rode to town for supplies on mornings when the sky had the yellow quality that meant weather coming. He kept the fire made up through the night without being asked. She tried once to tell him that he did not need to, that she had managed alone for years, and he looked at her with such a clear and uncomplicated expression and said, "I know you have managed. I just like doing things for you." And she found that she had no reasonable argument against this, and she let him do things for her, and it turned out that being cared for by a person who was good at it and honest about enjoying it was a very different experience from being cared for as an obligation. She told him about the drawing in the trunk. One evening in April, when the windows were open to the warm night for the first time since autumn. She had been wondering when to tell him for some time, and she had decided the time was when it felt like adding to something rather than explaining something, and this evening felt like adding to something. She went to the trunk and found the drawing and brought it out and set it on the table between them. He looked at it for a long time. "You drew this," he said. "When I was 12, she said. "The summer your family spent here, after the afternoon with the nail." She paused. "I wanted to remember the scar." He looked up at her. "Why?" She met his eyes. "Because I had decided at 12 years old and very seriously that I was going to marry you someday." The expression on his face went through several things in quick succession before it settled into something that was equal parts wonder and what she could only describe as a warmth so profound it was visible. "You decided at 12 years old to marry me," he said. "Specifically and without any doubt," she said. "I was a very decisive 12-year-old. And then I rode away with my family." "You did. And then 14 years later I collapsed on your porch." "You did," rather dramatically. He looked at the drawing again, at the careful pencil strokes of a 12-year-old girl, rendering a scar with the precision of someone who had something to remember. And then he looked at her across the table with those gray eyes that she had been looking into for 6 months, and that still had the capacity to catch her breath. "Georgia," he said. "Yes." "I think you should know," he said carefully, "that the afternoon with the nail when I climbed down from your father's apple tree and you wrapped my hand in your apron and told me to hold still, I thought you were the most remarkable person I had ever encountered." She looked at him. "You never said so." "I was 18, he said. "You were 12. There was nothing appropriate to say." He paused. "But I thought it, and I remembered it longer than I remembered most things." He touched the edge of the drawing with one finger. "I did not remember your name, and I am sorry for that, but I remembered you." She reached across the table and took his hand, the left one, and she fit her thumb into the curve of the scar, the way she had that day in November when they stood at the gate. And she thought that of all the roads that led from one place to another in this enormous and unreasonable landscape, the road that had led him back to her porch was the one she was most grateful for. The baby came in October, a week ahead of her calculation, arriving with the confident speed of a person who had decided on a direction and committed to it. Mrs. Dawson attended, and Georgia's nearest neighbor, a capable older woman named Vera Pike, who had brought a number of babies into the Harlow Creek territory, and Lionel was where she needed him to be throughout, which was nearby and useful and calm even when she suspected he was not particularly calm. Their son arrived in the early afternoon, with a pair of lungs he was evidently very pleased with, and Vera Pike handed him to Georgia and said, "A boy and a good-sized one," with the satisfaction of a person announcing something excellent. Georgia held him and looked at his face, red and creased and absolutely furious with the whole situation, and felt something that had no name and needed none. Lionel sat beside her on the bed and looked at his son, and his expression was one she had never seen on any person's face before, which was the expression of a man who had spent years believing himself to be fundamentally alone in the world, encountering irrefutable evidence that this was no longer the case. "Well," he said, very softly, looking at the baby. "Well," Georgia agreed. He put one finger into their son's hand, and the baby grabbed it with the blind conviction of the newborn, and Lionel looked at that small grip on his finger, and then at his wife, and they sat in the October afternoon with the knowledge of what they had made together. They named him Henry, after George's father. Lionel had suggested it first, and she had been moved enough by the suggestion that she had been unable to speak for a moment, and had then said yes with both hands pressed against her face, which he had come to recognize as her response to things that were too full for immediate expression. Henry Brooks Winslow was a baby of considerable opinions, communicated at volume. He nursed well and grew fast and had his father's gray eyes, which became apparent within the first few weeks, and which Georgia found unreasonably delightful. He had her dark hair, in the wisps that appeared first, and Lionel declared this to be a fine combination, and she agreed. The homestead expanded that first year in multiple directions simultaneously. Lionel had, through the late spring and summer, been in conversation with the Dawsons about purchasing the unused quarter section between their properties, and the purchase was completed in September, which gave them considerably more land than either of them had expected to be managing this soon. More land meant more planning, more work, and a more serious investment in what they were building. Lionel brought on a hired hand in the spring of the following year, a young man named Sam Byers, 17 years old and just arrived in the territory from Kansas, who was earnest and strong, and had the slightly overwhelmed look of a person encountering the size of the West for the first time. Georgia remembered this look. She made sure Sam had proper meals and a good place to sleep, and an environment in which learning was not treated as weakness, and he responded to this with the particular gratitude of a young person who had not always been shown that particular kind of respect. Lionel was a fair employer and an honest one. She watched how he treated Sam, and it confirmed things she already knew about her husband, and confirming things she already knew about him was one of her consistent private pleasures. The letter from Lionel's brother arrived in June of that second year. His younger brother, James, who had gone east with their mother and made a life there, had tracked Lionel down through a series of intermediate contacts, and the letter was tentative and careful, the letter of a man who was not sure of his reception but who had decided to try. He had a family now, the letter said, a wife and 2 children, and he had thought for a long time about writing, and had decided that whatever had come between them over the years was less than what had been there before. Lionel sat at the kitchen table with the letter for a long time, Georgia on the other side with Henry on her knee. "Are you going to write back?" she asked. "Yes," he said after a long pause. "Yes, I am." He wrote back that evening, and the correspondence that followed over the next several months was, she observed, doing something real and visible for him, filling in a part of the shape of his life that had been empty. She thought about what it meant to be a person without roots, moving through a landscape without anything fixed, and she thought about what it meant to begin to have roots, to plant them deliberately, and she knew what she hoped to be for him. She thought she was becoming it. In the 3rd year, they rode into Harlow Creek to visit Mrs. Aldridge, who was not well, and Georgia spent an afternoon at her bedside while Lionel arranged several things in town that needed arranging. When she came out of the Aldridge house, he was waiting at the hitching post with both horses and a paper bag that turned out to contain 2 pieces of hard candy and a small length of hair ribbon, blue, which she had mentioned once in passing 3 months ago that she liked the color of. She looked at the ribbon and then at him. "You remembered that," she said. "I remembered it," he said simply. She held the ribbon in her hand and looked at this man she had married, this weathered and genuine and careful man who listened to things she said and held them, who had ridden into her life bleeding and had chosen to stay and build something, who repaired what was broken and planted what was planted, and held his son with the specific and attentive way of a person to whom nothing about this was to be taken for granted. She reached up and kissed him on the cheek in the main street of Harlow Creek, which produced a look of warm surprise on his face and a small scandalized murmur from the direction of the dry goods store which she entirely ignored. "Thank you," she said. "Always," he said. They were quiet on the ride home, a comfortable quiet, the kind that only existed between people who were entirely at ease with each other. Henry was with Vera Pike for the afternoon, and the homestead was quiet when they arrived, and the late afternoon light fell across the valley in long gold lines, and the cottonwoods along the creek had gone to their autumn colors, and the fence that had once been falling down was repaired, and the gate that had been broken was fixed, and the garden that had been one person's garden was now something larger and more various and better tended. And the house that had been quiet through too many winters had fire in the hearth before sundown now, without anyone needing to decide. Lionel took the horses to the barn, and Georgia put on the kettle, and Russell the dog came to meet her at the door with his tail in a constant state of approval, and everything was precisely as it should be. She thought sometimes, in moments like this one, about what the shape of the world was and how it worked, and she never came to any settled conclusion except the one that felt most true, which was that some things that seemed like accident were not entirely accident, and some roads that seemed to lead away were simply taking the long route to where they were always going. A rusty nail in an apple tree, a scar on the back of a left hand, a man bleeding on a porch step, 14 years and a lifetime later. She put her thumb to her own left palm and thought about the line of that scar and what it had meant to a 12-year-old girl who had been paying attention. And she smiled to herself in the kitchen, with the kettle coming to heat on the stove, and the sound of her husband in the barn, and the dog at her feet, and the life they were building spread out around her like a thing still in the making, which was how good lives looked from the inside. The second baby was a boy, too. Born in the spring of 1882, Georgia's third year of marriage, arriving in the morning with considerably less urgency than Henry had and considerably more interest in sleeping, which was an immediate distinction of character. They named him Robert, after no one in particular except that both of them liked the sound of it, and it suited him when they tried it, the way names either suit people immediately or have to grow into them. Henry, by this time 3½, was old enough to have opinions about the baby, and expressed them in the thorough and continuous manner of a small person, discovering that the world is full of things he has views on. His initial view of Robert was suspicious, then competitive, then gradually and grudgingly affectionate, which Lionel observed with a fondness he did not attempt to conceal. "He is going to be exactly like me," Lionel said, watching Henry attempt to demonstrate to his infant brother how to hold a stick, while Robert blinked with mild bovine interest. "Lord help us all," Georgia said. "I take that as a compliment," Lionel said. "It was halfway won," she said. He put his arm around her and they watched their sons in the afternoon light, and she felt the weight and warmth of his arm as something so fully known, and yet still so specifically welcome, that she thought about what the word home meant in its largest possible sense. Not just the walls and the land and the familiar objects, but the arrangement of people and feeling, and the private compact between those who had chosen each other deliberately and well. Sam Byers, their hired hand, had grown in those years from an overwhelmed boy from Kansas into a young man who knew the land and knew the work, and was as much a part of the homestead's life as anyone else on it. He had developed a friendship with a young woman in town, the schoolteacher's daughter, and Lionel and Georgia had attended the engagement party that fall with a warmth that was genuine and also slightly recursive, given their own history. James Winslow and his family made the journey from Ohio in the summer of 1883, and it was one of the things that Georgia would carry with her in the good category, the way Lionel stood at the gate when James rode up, the way the two of them looked at each other after 9 years of distance and correspondence, and the way the embrace that followed had the quality of something being restored rather than established. James's wife, Ruth, was quiet and intelligent, and had the particular practical warmth of a woman who had also built a life from intentions rather than inheritance, and they were friends by the end of the first day. The children played together in the yard and made the inevitable chaos of children who have just met and are immediately certain of each other, and the adults sat on the porch in the evening and talked, and at one point Lionel was telling his brother something about the early cattle drive years and laughed at something, a real laugh, the full one she knew well, and James laughed too with the same quality to it, and Georgia looked at Lionel's brother and saw the same bones in the face, softer, domestic. And she thought about the apple tree and the scar and the specific improbability of how things had arrived at this particular porch, this particular evening, these particular people. She mentioned the apple tree to James because it seemed like the kind of story that families should have, and she wanted to make sure it was passed along. He fell from the apple tree, James said, looking at his brother with obvious pleasure. Rather spectacularly, Georgia said. I was 18, Lionel said. The branch was rotten. The branch was entirely sound, Georgia said. You were showing off. I was not showing off, he said, and the slight increase in his dignity confirmed that he had absolutely been showing off. What was he doing? James asked. He climbed it on a dare, Georgia said. I do not remember who dared him, some boy from the town. He climbed to the third branch and then came down rather quickly and cut his hand on the old nail on the way. And she wrapped it in her apron, Lionel said, and his voice was entirely unguarded, and told me to hold still with a firmness that I should have recognized at 12 as a characteristic I would spend the rest of my life being grateful for. James looked at his brother and then at Georgia with the expression of a person who has heard a great deal about something through correspondence and is now seeing it in person and finding that it is better than the description. I like her, James said to Lionel. Yes, Lionel said, looking at Georgia. So do I. She shook her head at both of them and went inside to check on the children, but she held the warmth of that exchange close for a long time. The years in Harlow Creek were years of building, and they were good years, not without difficulty. There was a drought in 1884 that put the garden behind and required the kind of practical reckoning with resources that was not pleasant but was survivable. There were the ordinary sorrows of a life in the territory, the neighbors who did not make it through their first hard winter, the children in town who got sick. There was a period when Lionel's old injury gave him trouble, the wound site stiffening in cold weather, and Georgia made a poultice that helped and added it to her store of knowledge. But the trajectory of those years was one of accumulation, of things being built that did not need to be rebuilt. The homestead grew. The land was worked carefully and it gave back what was put in. Henry and Robert grew from babies to children to boys who were beginning to be the early shadows of the people they would become. Henry serious and thoughtful, and drawn to books, Robert constantly in motion, and interested in the horses with a precocity that Lionel encouraged entirely. The letter from the county seat asking whether Lionel Winslow would be willing to serve as a justice of the peace came in the autumn of 1885. Georgia read it twice. You could do this, she said, setting it on the table in front of him. I know nothing about law formally, he said. You know more about justice practically than anyone in Harlow Creek, she said. Which is the relevant qualification? He read the letter and set it down and looked at the middle distance. It would mean being in town more, he said. More days, less time on the land. Sam is capable of managing the land, she said. And I am here. She paused. Lionel, you are the kind of man who should have this kind of role. You know that, he looked at her. You would not mind the change. I would adapt to the change, she said, because it would be a good change and you would be good at it, which is the correct sequence of reasoning. He accepted the appointment and he was good at it in exactly the ways she had known he would be because she knew him. He brought the same steadiness and the same honest attention to the work that he brought to everything. People trusted him, not because the office required trust but because he earned it. She attended his first formal proceeding in the Harlow Creek courthouse, which was also the meeting hall and the site of the Christmas dances, and she sat in the second row with Henry beside her and watched her husband conduct himself with a gravity and a fairness that made her, privately and precisely, proud. On a September evening in 1886, Georgia was sitting at the kitchen table after the boys were in bed. Lionel was reading, as he often did in the evenings, in the chair by the fire. The lamp was between them, and the dog was asleep by the hearth, and the night sounds of the territory came through the window, insects and distance, and the occasional low sound of the horses in the barn. She was thinking about something which he noticed because he noticed most things about her by now. "What is it?" he said without looking up from the book. "I was thinking about the porch," she said. "Which night on the porch?" "The first one," she said, "when I opened the door and you were there." He put the book down and looked at her. The lamplight was good in the room. "I have thought about that night many times," he said. "What do you think about?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I think about what it would have meant to have died on that road, without knowing who found me. Without ever having the chance to say that I remembered a girl in an apron on a porch step when I was 18, and that she was, and I say this having now known her for 8 years, exactly as remarkable as I thought she was then." He held her gaze. "I think about what it would have meant to have missed this." Georgia looked at this man, her husband, the gray-eyed, steady, particular person who had arrived bleeding and uncertain, and had chosen to stay and build and root himself here, in this ground, with her. And she thought that she could not find the beginning of where her life and his life had become a single thing, because there was no longer a seam between them. "I am glad you missed the road in the dark and found my porch instead," she said. "So am I," he said, "though I believe the accurate description is that I did not miss the road so much as I ran out of horse." "That is a less romantic framing," she said. "It is the honest framing," he said, with the small gravity he used when he was suppressing amusement. She got up from the table and crossed the room to him, and he moved the book and she sat beside him in the chair, which was large enough for 2 people if they were willing to be close, which they always were. He put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, and they sat in the fire-warm room with the sleeping dog and the quiet house around them. His left hand rested on her shoulder, and she put her right hand over it and felt the scar under her fingers the way she always did, with a recognition that was no longer surprising and had never stopped being something she was aware of. 8 years from the autumn night when he had fallen on her porch. 8 years from the moment she had looked at his hand in the lamplight and felt the floor shift under her. 2 suns and 1,000 mornings, and the long accumulated weight of a shared life, which was heavier than it sounded and bore a person up rather than down. She thought about the girl in the drawing, 12 years old with a pencil and a determination, and she thought that the girl had known something, had held it carefully through all the years of distance and change and the ordinary erosion of hope, and had been vindicated so thoroughly and so specifically that it was the kind of story you would not believe if it were told to you rather than lived. She believed it. She had lived it. "Lionel," she said quietly. "Georgia," he said. "I love you," she said. She said it not as a declaration but as a fact stated simply in the way that facts that are entirely true and entirely settled need to be stated. His arm tightened around her. His lips pressed against the top of her head, held there. "I love you," he said, also a fact, also simple, also entirely settled. The fire burned low in the hearth and Russell sighed in his sleep, and outside the window of the house that Henry Brooks had built on the flat New Mexico ground, the stars did what they had always done in the territory, blazed without apology across a sky too wide to fully take in, and the man and the woman sat together in the light until it was time to bank the fire and go to bed, and then they did that too. And in the morning they would wake to the sound of their children, and the horses and the dog and the ordinary magnificent life they were still in the middle of building, which was not finished and never would be, which was exactly how a life should be. And Georgia Brooks, who had become Georgia Winslow 8 years ago in a church that doubled as a schoolhouse with a fiddle played badly in her honor, went asleep that night with her head on her husband's shoulder and the knowledge, complete and closed and fully in her possession, that the 12-year-old girl on the porch steps had been right all along. Some things were worth waiting for. Some things, properly kept, came back. And some scars were not endings at all, but the very specific place where the story had begun.